Welcome back to our ongoing reading of White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. Today we are reading chapter 2 as far as I can get before my voice gives out, but I do have water, so here's hoping. Chapter 2, Racism and White Supremacy. Many of us have been taught to believe that there are distinct biological and genetic differences between races. This biology accounts for visual differences such as skin color, hair texture, and eye shape, and traits that we believe we see, such as sexuality, athleticism, or mathematical ability. The idea of race as a biological construct, instead of a social one, makes it easy to believe that many of the divisions that we see in society are natural. But race, like gender, is socially constructed. The differences that we see with our eyes, differences like hair texture and eye color, are superficial and emerged as adaptations to geography. Under the skin, there is no true biological race. The external characteristics that we use to define race are unreliable indicators of genetic variations between any two people. However, the belief that race and the differences associated with it are biological is very deep-seated. To challenge the belief of race as biology, we need to understand the social and economic investments that drove science to organize society and its resources along racial lines, and why this organization is so enduring. Header, Social Construction of Race in the United States. Freedom and equality, regardless of religion or class status, were radical new ideas when the United States was formed. At the time, the U.S. economy was based on the abduction and enslavement of African people, the displacement and genocide of indigenous people, and the annexation of Mexican lands from natives. Further, the colonizers who came were not free of their own cultural conditioning. They brought with them deeply internalized patterns of domination and submission. The tension between the noble ideology of equality and the cruel reality of genocide, enslavement, and colonization had to be reconciled. Thomas Jefferson, who himself owned hundreds of enslaved humans, and others turned to science. Jefferson suggested that there were natural differences between the races and asked scientists to find them. If science could prove that black people were naturally and inherently inferior, he saw indigenous people as culturally deficient, a shortcoming that could be remedied. There would be no contradiction between our professed ideals and our actual practices. There were, of course, enormous economic interests in justifying enslavement and colonization. Race science was driven by these social and economic interests, which came to establish cultural norms and legal rulings that legitimized racism and the privileged status of those defined as white. Drawing on the work of Europeans before them, American scientists began searching for the answer to the perceived inferiority of non-Anglo groups. Illustrating the power of our questions to shape the knowledge that we validate, these scientists didn't ask, are blacks and others inferior to whites? They asked, why are blacks and others inferior to whites? In less than a century, Jefferson's suggestion of racial difference became commonly accepted scientific fact. The idea of racial inferiority was created to justify unequal treatment. Belief in racial inferiority is not what triggered unequal treatment, nor was fear of difference. As Ta-Nehisi Coates states, but race is the child of racism, not the father. He means that first we exploited people for their resources, not according to how they looked. Exploitation came first, and then the ideology of unequal races to justify this exploitation followed. Similarly, historian Ibram Kendi, in his National Book Award-winning work, Stamped from the Beginning, explains, the beneficiaries of slavery, segregation, and mass incarceration have produced racist ideas of black people being best suited for or deserving the confines of slavery, segregation, or the jail cell. Consumers of these racist ideas have been led to believe there is something wrong with black people and not the policies that have enslaved, oppressed, and confined so many black people. Kendi goes on to argue that if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination. Subtitle: The Perception of Race. Race is an evolving social idea that was created to legitimize racial inequality and protect white advantage. The term white first appeared in colonial law in the late 1600s. By 1790, people were asked to claim their race on the census, and by 1825, the perceived degrees of blood determined who would be classified as Indian. From the late 1800s through the early 20th century, as waves of immigrants entered the United States, the concept of a white race was solidified. When slavery in the United States was abolished in 1865, whiteness remained profoundly important as legalized racist exclusion and violence against African Americans continued in new forms. To have citizenship and the rights citizenship imbued, you had to be legally classified as white. People with non-white racial classifications began to petition the courts to be reclassified. Now the courts were in the position to decide who was white and who was not. For example, Armenians won their case to be reclassified as white with the help of a scientific witness who claimed they were scientifically Caucasian. In 1922, the Supreme Court ruled that the Japanese could not be legally white because they were scientifically classified as Mongoloid. A year later, the court stated that Asian Indians were not legally white, even though they were also scientifically classified as Caucasian. To justify these contradictory rulings, the court stated that being white was based on the common understanding of the white man. In other words, people who are already seen as white get to decide who is white. The metaphor of the United States as the great melting pot, in which immigrants from around the world come together and melt into one unified society through the process of assimilation, is a cherished idea. Once new immigrants learn English and adapt to American culture and customs, they become Americans. But in reality, only European immigrants were allowed to melt or assimilate into dominant culture in the 19th and 20th centuries, because regardless of their ethnic identities, these immigrants were perceived to be white and thus could belong. Race is a social construction, and thus who is included in the category of white changes over time. As the Italian-American man from my workshop noted, European ethnic groups such as the Irish, Italian, and Polish were excluded in the past. But where they may have been originally divided in terms of origin, European immigrants became racially united through assimilation. This process of assimilation, speaking English, eating American foods, discarding customs that set them apart, eating American foods, discarding customs that set them apart, these reified the perception of American as white. Racial identification in the larger society plays a fundamental role in identity development, in how we see ourselves. If we look white, we are treated as white in society at large. For example, people of Southern European heritage, such as Spanish or Portuguese, or from the former Soviet Union, especially if they are new immigrants or were raised by immigrants, are likely to have a stronger sense of ethnic identity than will someone of the same ethnicity whose ancestors have been here for generations. Yet, although their internal identity may be different, if they pass as white, they will still have a white experience externally. If they look white, the default assumption will be that they are white, and thus they will be responded to as white. The incongruity between their internal ethnic identity, e.g., Portuguese, Spanish, and external racial experience, white, would provide a more complex or nuanced sense of identity than that of someone who doesn't have a strong ethnic identity. However, they are still granted white status and the advantages that come with that status. Today, these advantages are de facto rather than de jure, but they are nonetheless powerful in shaping our daily lives. It is on each of us who pass as white to identify how these advantages shape us, not to deny them wholesale. Because race is a product of social forces, it has also manifested along class lines. Poor and working class people were not always perceived as fully white. In a society that grants fewer opportunities to those not seen as white, economic and racial forces are inseparable. However, poor and working class whites were eventually granted full entry into whiteness as a way to exploit labor. If poor whites were focused on feeling superior to those below them in status, they were less focused on those above. The poor and working classes, if united across race, could be a powerful force, but racial divisions have served to keep them from organizing against the owning class who profits from their labor. Still, although working class whites experience classism, they aren't also experiencing racism. I grew up in poverty and felt a deep sense of shame about being poor, but I also always knew that I was white and that it was better to be white. Subtitle: Racism. To understand racism, we need to first distinguish it from mere prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is prejudgment about another person based on the social groups to which that person belongs. Prejudice consists of thoughts and feelings, including stereotypes, attitudes, and generalizations that are based on little or no experience and then projected onto everyone from that group. Our prejudices tend to be shared because we swim in the same cultural water and absorb the same messages. All humans have prejudice. We cannot avoid it. If I am aware that a social group exists, I will have gained information about that group from the society around me. This information helps me make sense of the group from my cultural framework. People who claim not to be prejudiced are demonstrating a profound lack of self-awareness. Ironically, they are also demonstrating the power of socialization. We have all been taught in schools, through movies, and from family members, teachers, and clergy that it is important not to be prejudiced. Unfortunately, the prevailing belief that prejudice is bad causes us to deny its unavoidable reality. Prejudice is foundational to understanding white fragility because suggesting that white people have racial prejudice is perceived as saying that we are bad and should be ashamed. We then feel the need to defend our character rather than explore the inevitable racial prejudices that we have absorbed so that we might change them. In this way, our misunderstanding about what prejudice is protects it. Discrimination is action based on prejudice. This is important. This is a definition. Discrimination is action based on prejudice. These actions include ignoring, exclusion, threats, ridicule, slander, and violence. For example, if hatred is the emotion we feel because of our prejudice, extreme acts of discrimination, such as violence, may follow. These forms of discrimination are generally clear and recognizable. But if what we feel is more subtle, such as mild discomfort, the discrimination is likely to also be subtle, even hard to detect. Most of us can acknowledge that we do feel some unease around certain groups of people, if only a heightened sense of self-consciousness. But this feeling doesn't come naturally. Our unease comes from living separately from a group of people while simultaneously absorbing incomplete or erroneous information about them. When the prejudice causes me to act differently, I'm less relaxed around you, or I avoid interacting with you. I'm now discriminating. Prejudice always manifests itself in action because the way I see the world drives my actions in the world. Everyone has prejudice and everyone discriminates. Given this reality, inserting the qualifier reverse is nonsensical. When a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it is transformed into racism, a far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions or self-images of individual actors. I'm going to read that one again too. When a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, transformed into racism, a far-reaching system that functions independently of the intentions or self-images of individual actors. I hope I pronounced this not too badly. J. Kihaulani Kawanui, professor of American Studies and Anthropology at Wesleyan University, explains, racism is a structure, not an event. This is important too. American women's struggle for suffrage illustrates how institutional power transforms prejudice and discrimination into structures of oppression. Everyone has prejudice and discriminates, but structures of prejudice, of oppression, go well beyond individuals. While women could be prejudiced and discriminate against men in individual interactions, women as a group could not deny men their civil rights. But men as a group could and did deny women their civil rights. Men could do so because they controlled all the institutions. Therefore, the only way women could gain suffrage was for men to grant it to them. Women could not grant suffrage to themselves. Similarly, racism, like sexism and other forms of oppression, occurs when a racial group's prejudice is backed by legal authority and institutional control. This authority and control transforms individual prejudices into a far-reaching system that no longer depends on the good intentions of individual people. It becomes the default of the society and is reproduced automatically. Racism is a system, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the intersection of race and gender in the example of suffrage. White men granted suffrage to women, but only granted full access to white women. Women of color were denied full access until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I, the reader, will add, since then as well, and we're seeing a resurgence in voter suppression at this time. Back to Robin DiAngelo's words, the important ones here. The system of racism begins with ideology, which refers to the big ideas that are reinforced throughout society. From birth, we are conditioned into accepting and not questioning these ideas. Ideology is reinforced across society, for example, in schools and textbooks, political speeches, movies, advertising, holiday celebrations, and words and phrases. These ideas are also reinforced through social penalties when someone questions an ideology, and through the limited availability of alternative ideas. Ideologies are the frameworks through which we are taught to represent, interpret, understand, and make sense of social existence. Because these ideas are constantly reinforced, they are very hard to resist, to avoid believing and internalizing. Examples of ideology in the United States include individualism, the superiority of capitalism as an economic system and democracy as a political system, consumerism as a desirable lifestyle, and meritocracy, the idea that anyone can succeed if he or she works hard. The racial ideology that circulates in the United States rationalizes racial hierarchies as the outcome of a natural order resulting from either genetics or individual effort or talent. Those who don't succeed are just not as naturally capable, deserving, or hardworking. Ideologies that obscure racism as a system of inequality are perhaps the most powerful racial forces, because once we accept our positions within racial hierarchies, those positions seem natural and difficult to question, even when we are disadvantaged by them. In this way, very little external pressure needs to be applied to keep people in their places. Once the rationalizations for inequality are internalized, both sides will uphold the relationship. Racism is deeply embedded in the fabric of our society. It is not limited to a single act or person, nor does it move back and forth, one day benefiting whites and another day or even era benefiting people of color. The direction of power between white people and people of color is historic, traditional, and normalized in ideology. Racism differs from individual racial prejudice and racial discrimination in that it has a historical accumulation and ongoing use of institutional power and authority that's used to support the prejudice and to systematically enforce discriminatory behavior with far-reaching effects. People of color may also hold prejudices and discriminate against white people, but they lack the social and institutional power that transforms their prejudice and discrimination into racism. The impact of their prejudice on whites is temporary and contextual. Whites hold the social and institutional positions in society to infuse their racial prejudice into the laws, policies, practices, and norms of society in a way that people of color do not. A person of color may refuse to wait on me if I enter a shop, but people of color cannot pass legislation that prohibits me and everyone like me from buying a home in a certain neighborhood. People of color may also hold prejudices and discriminate against their own and other groups of color, but this bias ultimately holds them down and in this way reinforces the system of racism that still benefits whites. Racism is a society-wide dynamic that occurs at the group level. When I say that only whites can be racist, I mean that in the United States, only whites have the collective social and institutional power and privilege over people of color. People of color do not have this power and privilege over white people. Many whites see racism as a thing of the past, and of course we are well served not to acknowledge it in the present. Yet racial disparity between whites and people of color continues to exist in every institution across society, and in many cases is increasing rather than decreasing. Although segregation may make these disparities difficult for whites to see and easy to deny, racial disparities and their effects on overall quality of life have been extensively documented by a wide range of agencies. Among those documenting these challenges are the U.S. Census Bureau, the United Nations, academic groups such as the UCLA Civil Rights Project and the Metropolis Project, and nonprofits such as the NAACP and the Anti-Defamation League. Scholar Marilyn Fry uses the metaphor of a bird cage to describe the interlocking forces of oppression. If you stand close to a bird cage and press your face against the wires, your perception of the bars will disappear and you will have an almost unobstructed view of the bird. If you turn your head to examine one wire of the cage closely, you will not be able to see the other wires. If your understanding of the cage is based on this myopic view, you may not understand why the bird doesn't just go around the single wire and fly away. You might even assume that the bird liked or chose its place in the cage. But if you stepped back and took a wider view, you would begin to see that the wires come together in an interlocking pattern, a pattern that works to hold the bird firmly in place. It now becomes clear that a network of systematically related barriers surrounds the bird. Taken individually, none of these barriers would be that difficult for the bird to get around. but because they interlock with each other, they thoroughly restrict the bird. While some birds may escape from the cage, most will not. And certainly those that do escape will have to navigate many barriers that birds outside the cage do not. The birdcage metaphor helps us understand why racism can be so hard to see and recognize. We have a limited view. Without recognizing how our position in relation to the bird defines how much of the cage that we can see, we rely on single situations, exceptions, and anecdotal evidence for our understanding, rather than stepping back and seeing the broader interlocking patterns. Although there are always exceptions, the patterns are consistent and well documented. People of color are confined and shaped by barriers and forces that are not accidental, occasional, or avoidable. These forces are systematically related to each other in ways that restrict movement. Individual whites may be against racism, but they still benefit from a system that privileges whites as a group. David Wellman succinctly summarizes racism as a system of advantage based on race. These advantages are referred to as white privilege, a sociological concept referring to advantages that are taken for granted by whites and that cannot be similarly enjoyed by people of color in the same context: government, community, workplace, schools, etc. But let me be clear. Stating that racism privileges whites does not mean that individual white people do not struggle or face barriers. It does mean that we do not face the particular barriers of racism. As with prejudice and discrimination, we can remove the qualifier reverse from any discussion of racism. By definition, racism is a deeply embedded historical system of institutional power. It is not fluid, and it does not change direction simply because a few individuals of color manage to succeed. That's all for today's reading. Please join us tomorrow for the second part of Chapter 2. Go in peace. Purchase this book. Amen.